Right, I enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure how to start because I don't think I've ever been trolled before at the beginning of a session, but the BBC with its terrible predictions of climate change. I'm Jamie Kumarasamy, by the way. I am a presenter, host for BBC Radio, and I hadn't seen that before. Peter keeps these things a closely guarded secret. But I do know John Hammond, the guy that featured in that, he actually works for the BBC now. He's a meteorologist. He's also a newsreader. We often share a studio together. I will see him in about 3 days' time in the studio. I can tell him he was the star, one of the stars of the Halifax Security Forum. This is a wonderful occasion. First of all, let me thank Peter and everyone for the invitation. I think this is now my 5th Halifax, and I feel part of the family, which I think in conversations over the last couple of days, it really is a family here. Peter's done such a great job of, as well as bringing a great array of guests from government, from think tanks, from all over the world, but actually to create this place where we can have interesting, stimulating discussions like this, I hope, but also to see friends, make new friends. So a big thanks to Peter and the team for doing such a great job. For understandable reasons, the main focus of this weekend has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war, a war of choice, a war for territory, a war with existential implications for the people of Ukraine. But this session is dedicated to an issue which, as we saw in that video, spans the world and does have existential implications for all of us, and that's climate change. The title refers to water, and water, of course, is the most visual, the most tangible manifestation of how our world is warming and the impacts that we all feel as a result of it. These extreme events linked, and no one doubts the linkage. You might debate to what extent they are caused by, but certainly linked to our warming planet. And as we saw there, this year has seen some incredibly extreme, we call them extreme, they're becoming more and more, sadly, run-of-the-mill events, but still extreme nonetheless. The worst floods in 500 years, worst heat wave, should I say, in Europe in 500 years. That's according to the EU's Copernicus Environmental Institute. And as well as having dry rivers, countries have had terrible problems with the heat in terms of the impact on health, but the rivers have had an impact on transportation, agriculture. In France, for example, nuclear power plants unable to get the water they need to be cooled. And then, of course, we've had the drought in the Horn of Africa, which has led to, 20 million people facing starvation, 7 million children facing malnutrition, killing livestock, killing livelihoods, displacing large numbers of people, and we'll talk about that during this panel. And then places like Pakistan having the opposite issue, the problem of flooding, which in Pakistan's case took in a third or so of the country. I think in a North America analogy, at one province, Sindh, the flood waters covered an area of the state of Virginia. Nigeria, Australia, the list goes on, Chad, Honduras. Basically, climate change and its impacts are here and are in our face. And for this discussion, we have 3 people who are going to address various aspects of it. Now, I want this, excuse this pun because I'm prone to them, I do want this to be free-flowing as a conversation. I want to bring you all in as soon as possible, but I do want to start with our 3 panellists, starting, in fact, 3 panellists who are a trio of acronyms, I would say. We've got MEME, not that sort. We've got HIAS, and we've got COVE. So we've got 3 different acronyms. which will help us anchor where we are. I'll start with meme. Dalia Ziada is an expert on international security. That's her field of study. She's from Egypt. She works between Egypt and the United States. And meme stands for her Center for Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean Studies, of which she is the executive director. Next along, we have Mark Hetfield, who is president of HIAS. HIAS stands for Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which tells you about the origin of this humanitarian organization, but not about its global reach now. 27 countries you're working in?
22.
22. Say 27. 22 countries. It's a humanitarian organization, works with refugees, works with people who are forced to migrate for a whole variety of reasons, but one of them certainly is our changing climate. And last but not least, our local panel member, Melanie Nadeau. So appropriate that her name has the French word for water in it. I'm sure you all speak French, so think about it. She's the CEO of COVE, which is a Centre for Ocean Ventures and Entrepreneurship based here in Halifax. She is someone with a naval background, was in the Canadian Royal Navy, an engineer by training as well, and works now on sustainable innovation, on solutions. So very much a solutions based person on our panel, looking at how to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And we'll talk about some of the sort of innovative work she's involved with here as well. But perhaps having introduced you, I'll get you to slightly introduce yourself as well. And maybe a question, because we are talking about climate change on the day, or just after, the COP27 conference has wrapped up, appropriately enough, in Egypt, in your home country, Dalia, and you were there right at the beginning of COP27 for the youth part of it. I don't know if I've spoken to a couple of people here who managed to combine COP27 with Halifax as well, so I don't know if there's anyone who's been at COP, but welcome any contributions on your thoughts. That esteemed media outlet, the BBC, has just posed a question, I see, on its website. Is this the most successful or the least successful COP since Paris? I mean, what would you say has come out of this? Because on the one hand, there are some positives, notably on this question of loss and damage and commitments to countries which feel that they have contributed little to climate change but have been forced to bear the brunt of its impact. And we've seen an interesting rapprochement, if that's not too strong a word, between the United States and China, at least talking again about climate change after some time when they were not talking. But on the actual issue of climate change, the initial verdict seemed to be actually very little movement has happened since COP26 in Glasgow. So I wonder what your thoughts are.
So actually, first of all, good morning. I'm happy to be here as always. It's a very interesting question, whether COP27 is the most successful or the least successful is two extremes. So I will try to stop in the middle and say that it was appropriately successful on both the official and the non-official levels. On the non-official level, for a while now in Egypt, I'm sure you've been noticing that we did not have this space of free speech, people protesting and expressing themselves. So it was nice to see that happening. And it opened the space somehow, put some kind of pressure that allowed for activists to appear again and to be liked again by the popular basis after long years of being actually stigmatized or being called agents to the West. But now people are seeing they are advocating for issues that very much relate to them. On the official level, yes, it was successful. And I think the success, the best thing that came out of this conference is the fact that for the first time, maybe unlike all the previous climate change conferences on that level, we can see there is some kind of solidarity and understanding between the global north and the global south. It's not anymore the global north is doing the mistake of polluting the world and the global south is suffering the consequences of this mistake. Now all of us are suffering the consequences of climate change, the food security issues, the energy security, the energy crisis, even the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war, which all of us are suffering either from the global south or the global north. And this was beautifully translated into what we have seen, the loss and damage fund. And the best thing about it is the goal of the fund, for the first time, uses the word to protect rather than to compensate. The goal is to protect the vulnerable developing countries against the adverse effects of climate change. In all the previous calls for making such a fund, there was always a call to compensate the developing countries for the mistakes of the industrial wealthy countries. So this shows how this solidarity is beautifully translated into this action. Also, actually, we have seen several world leaders coming together, maybe in contexts they wouldn't be in normal life or in normal cases, which also allowed the opening of discussions on other levels, like not only about climate issues, but also social, trade, business, and even political issues.
Okay, so an upbeat assessment from you. I'm going to go over to Melanie, perhaps, because you've been involved in COPs in the past, haven't you? You've seen the process close up. What's your assessment?
Well, it's hard to say if this has been a good or a bad COP. And in fact, the conversations are still happening as we're here today. But I think the important thing to note is the discussion and the dialogue that is happening amongst global leaders and the side conversations. So the point that there is positive that happens in sidebar conversations, and that's what that event is really important for. I've been involved in advising the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for a long time. And when you think about what that panel, and those are international scientists from all over the world, top of their game, who are advising leaders about what the impact of climate change is going to have and how quickly it's going to progress. And so if you think about, where these conversations started, you might remember the Kyoto Protocol over 20 years ago. And that's where we first started talking about climate change, and the dialogue began. And the IPCC was saying there's warmth that's happening to this planet caused by human behavior, and which we were all trying to understand. And then that dialogue continued. My concern is, though, so we'll see how these discussions continue, but my concern is there's talk. With the Paris Agreement, there was a decision to go to let's not increase more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's discussion right now that maybe that's not the right number. It should be higher. And that's a goal for the end of the century, to not increase by 1.5 degrees Celsius. So
that's going backwards.
It is going backwards. And the thing that we've seen over 20 years is that we keep moving the needle. We are acting on changing the needle in the opposite direction. And I think, that's where I get concerned. That's where, people who've been working in this space for a long time are challenged by that. So I think that's really important. And the other point that somebody was surfaced in the conversations we've been having here, and the question was asked is, how do you prevent a war? Well, you just don't become complacent. And it's the same thing from a climate change point of view. We cannot become complacent. So even though the needle of the targets are moving, us as organizations, industry, investors, advocates, we cannot become complacent, even though the target keeps changing, and maybe not in the direction that it should. So I think that's important to remember, and that's why the sidebar conversations that happen in these big meetings are very, very important. And the last thing that I will say, again, I don't, the new fund is very good news. I don't know yet all the positives that are going to come out of COP27, but one of the things that I think that was very positive with COP26 was the financial alliance that was established. And these are financiers, these are banks that were set up to focus on net zero. And that's really, really important. And this is not about the 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is about investors who have trillions of assets that they manage all over the world, and they can make a difference. And they can make a difference where they are going to invest, what they're not going to go and invest in. And I think that is a really tremendous outcome that happened with COP26. Now, the challenge is you've got to make sure that you continue, you implement, and you continue in that vision of net zero, but those are the things that do make a big difference.
So when it comes to those side conversations, are they really the main event in some aspects? Because one of the criticisms, and it's being made sort of this one certainly, is that business and other stakeholders, yes, they are involved and they are very much there in the discussions, but actually when the decisions are made, it's still on a governmental level. And as you, as a sort of someone who's in private sector, looking at private sector solutions, do you believe that the private sector is playing a sufficient role, or does have the kind of key role in this?
Well, I'll go back to the investors. I think that there is still a great lack of investment that is going towards finding the solutions to help support the transition that will aim to reduce the impacts of climate change. So, and the private sector does have a big role to that, as does the government. So the government can help de-risk. The government can provide a lot of clarity. So when there's rules that are changing, that's also a very uncertain investment scenario. So when the rules are changing or the needle moves in the direction you didn't think it was going to, well, that creates a very uncertain investment climate. So whether you're in government, you're in industry, you're in financing or whatnot. And so government has a role to play in providing a level of certainty around the future so that investment, entrepreneurs, et cetera, can start figuring out how to solve these major problems that we have related to climate change.
Thanks. Mark, let's bring you in because we're looking at the impact of climate change. People is somehow will be a consequence of the way our planet is changing. But I wonder to what extent, from your experience, do you think it is happening now?
Right, Jamie. Climate change, climate migration is not something we have to prepare for because it's already here. It's too late to prepare. We now have to address it. The official number I've heard is that 20 million people per year are already being displaced due to climate change. I frankly think that is a very lowball estimate. 70% of the world's 105 million refugees and forcibly displaced persons today come from the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And they migrate not just because of natural disasters, although that's one reason, not just because their countries may soon be submerged by water, which is another reason, but because the land where they live, you can no longer live on it. It's too hot. You can no longer grow crops on it. You can no longer raise livestock on it. So they have to move. And the problem with the way countries are acting, governments are acting, especially those governments that produce the most greenhouse gases, is that they're not addressing the causes of climate migration. They're not addressing climate migration. They're addressing climate migrants. So governments are investing a lot of money in migration management, in keeping the migrants out of their country, rather than acting collectively that these people who are fleeing for their lives have a place to go, or better yet, that they don't have to flee at all. And part of the problem, and like so many other things we talk about at Halifax, is that the entire international framework for addressing migration, for addressing refugees, was written in the context of the Second World War. It was written in 1951 to address displacement in Europe from the Second World War. It has not been updated since. And these are not people who are fleeing on behalf because of their race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion, but they are fleeing for their lives. And they have no right to flee if you're fleeing starvation, if you're fleeing just to live. So this has to be addressed.
What would the forum for that be?
Well, I mean, the forum, and I have to say, the good news, if there is any good news, is that it's being talked about a lot. And it's talked about in the Compact on Migration that was passed overwhelmingly by the General Assembly. It's talked about in the Compact on Refugees. But it's a lot of talk. And you can have all the talk you want in the United Nations, but you have to have states taking action. And without states taking action, this is not going to get any better. And I'll also say that in terms of COP27, there was one passing mention of migrants in the final document. So it's not being talked about there, at least not enough.
Right. Dalia, what about in the region? I mean, the other aspect, of course, of water, and it's particularly relevant to Egypt, is the potential for conflict, the potential to argue about access to water. Egypt, Ethiopia, and the Nile is potential flashpoint. Where are we with things? Where are we with that?
Actually, it's interesting. Like the title of our session is H2O, which is refers to water, which I think will be the next global crisis in the series of crises that we are going through after the energy crisis and the food crisis. Sooner or later, we will see again the autocratic countries are trying to deprive or practice, weaponize water as a tool to pressure other countries to submit to them, as we have been seeing Russia weaponizing food and energy. So far, China is already doing this with its neighbors, weaponizing water to influence them and affect their future and security. In Egypt, the case is a little bit different. I hope, God forbid, we never get to the point of a military conflict about it, but it's seriously an international security issue, this conflict that's happening around the Nile River. It's not only an African issue, it's not only an issue related to East Africa alone, because every time Egypt and Sudan try to approach the international community to intervene in this issue and try to come with a solution, it's always pushed away by saying it's not a European issue, it's not a Western issue, it's not a global issue, it's only an African issue. And every time we go back to the African Union, we unfortunately don't get to any results. For decades now, actually, more than a decade, but it has been going on, the negotiation has been going on for decades about not like the Ethiopians are promoting. It's not about depriving them from their sovereign right to build dams or to do whatever they want on their lands, but simply to sign a binding agreement with Egypt and Sudan that guarantees Egypt and Sudan are the downstream countries of the river. So they want to sign an agreement with Ethiopia to guarantee their right in the water Nile and thus guarantee their own water security. Marco was talking about the huge number of immigrants and refugees. It's really shocking, and I don't want to see this happening in my country, Egypt, because actually some of the farmers who, especially in the northern cities, northern urban cities, started to think about this from now. The idea of if the Nile stopped running up to our farms, we will simply think about crossing the Mediterranean to the other side, to Europe, which will again renew the crisis of illegal immigration, which Egypt has been successfully controlling for about 5 years or 7 years even now. So we don't want to see this happening again, and I hope the Nile River conflict will be taken care of by the international community before it's too late.
Melanie, what about solutions? Because you work on solutions, don't you, for both monitoring how the climate's changing, underwater, overwater. Tell us, give us some hope.
Yeah, there is good news. There is good news. So You know, we talked about food security yesterday, and I live in the tech space, so even when we look at fishing and seafood, which is a really important protein for the world, there's a lot of waste right now that happens. And this is that we've got to change the way that we're doing things today. And so there's about 10 million metric tons of waste that gets produced from the catch of the fish to plate. And so there's really interesting ways to reduce that waste. And just to give you a sense, that's like over 4,500 Olympic swimming pools of food, of high protein food that could feed a lot of people. So there's a lot of things right now that are happening around that from a tech point of view. One is looking at imaging and artificial intelligence to reduce the bycatch, as an example, so that it is the high protein that you're actually catching and that you're not impacting the biodiversity. The other thing that's also really quite interesting, a tech that right now that's out there is ropeless fishing gear, which is quite big all over the world. And that's twofold really interesting because it reduces this issue of bycatch and waste, as an example, with ropeless fishing gear, but it also reduces, from an environmental point of view, the plastics that are largely attributed to fishing around the world that end up in our oceans. So about 70%, 60 to 70% of the microplastics that are in the ocean are associated with fishing gear. And microplastics, the reason that they're important is because they're consumed by fish, by different species, and they're also very difficult to collect. And so that's really important as well. The other thing that I wanted to mention, because I've also been involved in electric vehicles for 20 years, believe it or not, but we're seeing, we're talking about China, so China is one of the major manufacturers of electric vehicles and really has a very strong supply chain, one of the world's most strong supply chain electric vehicles. The interesting thing as we're moving towards electrification globally, which is a good thing, it's part of our path to decarbonization, is that we do have some challenges that are coming very quickly around that, and one related to batteries. So lithium that is being mined in certain countries of the world, there's a forecast right now that the lithium that we have currently planned with the electrification plans that are happening in China and other parts of the world, that's going to start to stave off around 2027, 2030. So that's coming up very quickly. So we need to start thinking about either how we're going to mine more lithium in other parts of the world. There's an opportunity to mine lithium from the bottom of the ocean where there is actually a lot of lithium. But then that's a whole other conversation about deep sea mining, which I don't know that we have time to talk about here. But just to talk about solutions again, so if that's the case on lithium, and lithium is going to be it's a very important mineral for the world from a battery point of view, we've got to also start working on other solutions. So one of the other options for lithium battery is sodium-ion batteries. And sodium-ion batteries comes from salt water. It's salt. Essentially, and it's not that simple, but essentially that's where sodium comes from. And we have an abundance with the ocean of salt. So those are the type of things that we really need to start working on, and working at a much quicker pace, I would say, than we have been historically.
And Mark, you were saying that the world has not been prepared or has seen this migration crisis as a result of climate change happen without the structures in place to deal with it. I mean, in terms of mitigation from the refugee point of view, are there things that could be done?
Well, I mean, the most important thing to do is to make sure that the temperature doesn't rise more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? That will address the root cause, but as I said, it's already happening. And so we have to take seriously our obligations, at least to the 1951 Refugee Convention. If we can't even address that, we can't address climate migration. And the number of refugees is growing every year. Right now, it's at the highest number in human history because states are not trying to find solutions for refugees. And my first year at Halifax was in 2015, where I was hoping the lesson was being learned that refugees do not present a localized problem. Right? It is an international problem, and Europe learned that the hard way in 2015 when the Syrian refugee crisis came to Europe. Right? But apparently we still have not yet learned that lesson, and we continue to focus on migrants rather than migration, and that focus has to change.
And Dalia, you've touched on this a bit, but I wonder in terms of the global geopolitical situation, the war in Ukraine, the fact that it has led to some countries rowing back on certain green obligations or thinking about energy security, and that's changed the dynamic a bit. To what extent do you feel that it's overshadowing efforts to decarbonize?
Actually, yeah, unlike, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war is so tragic, and most of the countries of the world has condemned this war, but I don't know, somehow I can see a bright side coming out of this war in terms ways that it's pushing certain actors on the global stage to work together in a ways that they have never been working together before. Look, for example, at the water crisis I was just speaking about a moment ago, how it's encouraging both countries like Egypt and Israel to come together to cooperate on energy issues, exporting natural gas to Europe, and also cooperating on issues related to the distillation of water. Israel is very advanced in this technology, distillation technology, and Egypt went to it to ask, how can we use your technology, or how you can help us with your advanced technology to improve our ability to distillize water. And they are cooperating on this now. Recently also, speaking about the grain and the grain deal and all the issues that has been going around, we started to see better cooperation between the Mediterranean countries in terms with looking for ways to store the grains and to improve even their agricultural capabilities in order to satisfy their needs. So this kind of cooperation, I think, is the best thing that's coming out of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Also, if it would be good if, I always like to use this metaphor, we are now seeing some kind of mobilization between mobilization of the arsenal of democracy against the arsenal of autocracy. And it's because of this Russia-Ukraine war. And it's definitely in the best interest of the arsenal of democracy to attract more and more people to its side. And the more and more countries that are willing, really, unlike, of course, what we are seeing in media all the time, all these conflicts and talks about different perspectives about issues like human rights, for example, between the countries of the Middle East and the United States. But I believe most of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa region are really willing to join the arsenal of democracy. It only needs the leaders of the arsenal of democracy to be very careful about how to approach them, to reach them, to encourage them to join their parades, and also to be understanding to their needs. And by the way, I don't want my words to be misunderstood in any way, because some people recently were trying to say that for the United States to attract Middle Eastern countries to its side, it has to stop talking about issues like human rights and democratization. But in fact, no, on the contrary, the talk about democratization, encouraging the process of democratization has always should always remain part of the conversation between the West, or the leaders of the arsenal of democracy, and the countries of the Middle East that are willing to do this. So I think it should be on the agenda next year.
Okay, well, we've sort of moved, I guess, past our agenda for this hour, so I think that's probably a good time to throw the conversation to the audience. If anyone's got some couple of questions. So, lady over there.
Thank you so much. Solange Marquez, I'm from Mexico. The question is for Mark. And after COP27, they agreed a fund for states to help them to rise up after all the consequences of climate change. But small island states face the threat of not exist in the long future. So how are we going to address them? Because during COP27, they said, okay, we will give you money, but that money is not going to help me to find another place and soil to start a new state. So what we are going to do with that?
You're right, and the only solution is migration. There's only a migration solution to that, quite obviously. And the international community, or the states that make up the international community, can't keep being ostriches and put their heads in the sand and solve that problem with money alone. You're right, there needs to be an agreement as to how that's going to be addressed.
John.
Thank you very much. My name is John Glenn. I'm with the National Endowment for Democracy, and I want to say how pleased I am to see the conversation about water and climate in our security context. But it's in that context that I'd like to ask the three panelists to share with us your assessment of China's participation in COP27. Within the security conversation, we often have a principled statement about we'll compete where we must and cooperate where we can. And while I share that vision, it's a vision that's proven very difficult to implement with China, which often exists on linkages between how we behave in one area and how they do in another. I've been following somewhat. I'm personally pleased that the US and China have agreed to resume conversations about it, but I'd be interested in your assessment of either China's at the COP27 or what you would hope that they could contribute to this conversation and this challenge.
Who'd like to take that on first? Melanie, maybe?
Well, there's no doubt from a climate point of view that China has to be part of the conversation. China, when you look at just the energy landscape, China's it's about 50% of their energy now is renewable. And they are a powerful country in terms of technology that they're developing, and they're bypassing a lot of countries like the US and others in their not only deployment, but also their technology advantage that they're experiencing. So I think it would be remiss if we don't figure out how to work with China on solving this global challenge that we really have around climate change. So good, what's the good and the bad of COP27? I think the good is the US and China are in conversation, as you pointed out. I think that seems very positive.
Yeah, that's a hard question, and one I think a lot about. Again, I see it strictly through a migration lens where I sit, and large autocracies like China and Russia are not good homes for refugees and for displaced persons, right? And so the role that they can play in that regard is rather limited, but they have to be held to account for their treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, including climate migrants. And they have to be held to account for creating refugees, such as the Uyghurs from China. There's a lot of work for the international community to do on that front.
So I think actually China is part of the problem, not part of the conversation somehow. So I think it's, for example, in Africa, China is the largest investor, but also one of the largest polluters of Africa. So we have, in general, a problem in the international community about this issue of accountability, how to hold certain countries accountable for what they are doing, hurting other countries on all levels, not only on the climate level, but also on the political levels and other levels. So when we get to a point on how to hold countries accountable for what they do regarding climate, I think at that time we'll be able to force China and other countries on the autocratic arsenal again, who would not listen otherwise.
Force.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Force them.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll see how that works out. Helen's got a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the work that you're doing. Just to start on a positive point, I think the fact that the COP27 took place on the African continent is a very good signal. However, we have this feeling of a glass half empty at the end of every COP that takes place. And is it not the case that whatever announcement is made, and I think the main one will be the creation of a fund, is that none of these measures are constraining? And my question is simple. What will it take for governments and the international community to invest in prevention rather than in reaction and fixing up the damages, which today starts costing far more than the investment that will be needed in renewable energies, in indeed preventing immigration with the destabilization of democracies. Today we have just a few thousand people crossing the Mediterranean, but in the future there will be millions of them going up north, trying to simply have a normal and decent life for their families. So,
I don't know, is that maybe one for you, Melanie?
Sure. I mean, it's a very, very hard question because we've been working at it for so long, right? I mean, even here in Halifax, so we had our most expensive storm that just happened a few weeks ago. It was post-tropical storm Fiona, and that's been our most expensive storm on record that we've had here. So, and we had the military involved in that, so the military was engaged in that. That is happening all over the world, and it's going to start happening very, very closely. So we need a lot of education for people, because they see a crisis, we move on, and then you forget about it. And then it happens again, you forget about it. So we need to engage in the conversation with governments, but also people. And people are going to be solving this challenge. It's probably not going to be the governments. The governments will set a target, a direction. They will invest, but I think people are going to make the change to try to get to a point where we're not increasing past 1.5 degrees Celsius. And people are going to be demanding, youth are going to be demanding it. And this is what's interesting around climate, because youth are having an increasingly bigger voice. And that is going to change how the dynamic of the conversation over time, because I think they're just not going to accept it. And at some point, and it's already happening, and I know you were there, but it's already happening that youth are having such a loud voice. And it's interesting when I was hearing about, we were talking about the Ukraine last night, and you know, it is a younger generation that is going to rebuild Ukraine. And they're digitizing Ukraine. It's going to be completely different. And youth are going to have a big say in what's going to happen next. And I think in climate, they're going to have an even bigger say. And so why do I care? I care because I've got a five-year-old son. And I want my son in 20 years and 30 years to be not saying, Mom, why didn't you do anything about it? And I think that's going to be the message to a lot of people. It's going to hit home. At some point, it's going to hit home. And then individually, as people, we're going to take stronger and stronger action. So not an answer to your question, but it is a hard question.
Yeah, and sorry, I was remiss not asking actually, when you asked your question, if you wouldn't mind standing up and identifying yourself. I think down here was the next person.
I was hoping I could sit down, James.
Sorry.
Nancy Southern, CEO and Chair of ATCO. I really just have an observation, and I'd love you to comment on it. What's striking me about this panel, which I think has been terrific, is the world taking a bit of a siloed approach to ESG. And it seems to me that a more holistic approach to ESG should be understood and actually worked on, and perhaps even add a few of letters to the acronym. Perhaps economic, EE, security and social, defense and governance, which what you're talking about really is impacting and touching every aspect of what we talk about here in Halifax and all of our worlds. So I want to thank you all for enlightening me and providing me with this observation of what we're talking about too often is a siloed approach.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.
Let's have a look. At the back, a hand up.
Good morning. I'm Lincoln Bloomfield from Washington. Thank you for your comments. I'd like to come back to the film that we've seen, which are incidents which have already happened, and the 1.5 degrees Celsius and timelines. And I'd like to ask the panelists this question. We hear what we're going to get done by 2050 and what we're going to get done by 2040. And the tendency of average people is to say, well, we'll get serious about it at 2035 or 2045. We have a deadline coming up, we better run faster. And there's a tendency to say, well, the government will take care of it. My challenge to the panelists is, tell us what we can do between right now and 2030 at the citizen level all over the world. What can everyone at the Halifax Security Forum go home and tell everyone they know to do right now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Mark, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I mean, first of all, we all have to set an example, right? And so all of us are looking at our own carbon footprint. You know, the NGO sector, the international organizations are all looking at our own carbon footprint and urging states to do the same and to act immediately, because it is an emergency. As I said, climate change, it's not coming, it's already here. We have a 100-year storm every year now.
Dalia.
I have a quick comment. Actually, thank you for bringing up the power of the people, because I think we, the ordinary people, are the actual game changer here, not the decision makers. Decision makers' hands are always tied by elections, by their own policies, by many things. So it's good you brought up the issue of the power of the people. What should we be doing from now until 2030? Or even beyond? There are certain plans that has been put on place, but first of all is that we have to educate the public that climate issues are not a luxury, are not something that comes after the other crises we're facing. It's an urgent crisis that we have to immediately deal with. And regarding the long-term plan, and this also has to deal with Ellen's question, I think there are certain statistics that could give us a guideline on how to proceed from the COP. The first of which is an action plan that Africa came up with before COP27 to have 25, the plan is for Africa Acceleration Adaptation Program, and they are asking for $25 billion over the next 5 years. Of course, countries has promised since 29 to provide funds for the acceleration of the adaptation, especially in Africa. For example, in 29, there were promises about funding about $100 billion per year for the next 20 years, until 2020. This never happened, by the way. These were only promises. So maybe it's time now to mobilize as people and pressure our governments, or try to find even ways to fundraise amongst each other to combat this. So this is one of the plans that we may follow on.
Melanie, one thing.
Well, I think we need to, just take an example in the VC space, talk about solutions. There are solutions in the market, and there's going to be more solutions, because this whole energy transition period is complex. And there will be continuously different solutions over time that will be developed that will be better and better and better. But talking about the VC space for a sec, the VC space, so the venture capital space, which invests in businesses, new ideas, people, only is between 2 and 3% of investments are made into female-led companies. So what does that mean? That means that females are not part of the solution. So then if you look at other groups, other underrepresented groups, it gets lower and lower, and in fact the stats, we can't even capture the stats on that. And so, we need to be thinking about solutions and engaging different people in the conversations and different people to drive the solutions. And I think, if there's one thing you could do, you could say, make sure that people at the table look very different to come up with the answers that we need to solve these big problems.
Great. Well, time for one final question. I think that the hand was slightly first, so gentleman here. There's a...
Hi, Daryl Bricker from Ipsos. So we do global public opinion research. I ask about climate change every month. 30 countries, we just put out a new poll. We got another one coming out, 29 countries. Climate change, on a list of 18 issues, most important issue facing you, the one that you're most concerned about, any month, 8 to 10. When we ask people what they're prepared to do for climate change, the answer is basically nothing. So where's the failure here? I mean, we can't come off a allegedly successful COP27. We've been talking, banging on about this. We've got people gluing themselves to paintings and galleries. None of it seems to be cutting through. Where's the failure? In terms of bringing the public on side with this.
Yeah, it's a big one. I don't know who wants to take that one on briefly.
I think the failure is that there are other things that are taking the priority right now. And the talk about climate change is happening at the time when the world is having many crises. The war is happening in Eastern Europe. People are not sure about their own food security. So all of these factors together make, and even issues related to human rights, and so all of these factors make climate change seem very small next to them. That's why,
despite what we're seeing.
despite, of course, it's very important. But so I think it's about education, educating the public about the importance of the issue.
Mark, I don't really want to end on failure, but that's the way we've come to. But what?
Well, and it goes to the question, what can we do right now, right, between now and 2030? And that's what we have to do, is we have to, I hate to say it, but we have to scare the daylights out of people. Like, instead of making migrants the boogeyman, maybe we should make climate change the boogeyman, because that is what's going to ruin us all if we don't address it. Every single person is going to be affected.
Very briefly, Melanie?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question because I don't understand. I don't know why, but I do think that when you're thinking about, well, two things. When you're thinking about youth, and youth are our future, they care. And I hope that they care in 20 years and 30 years where we've sort of just been complacent. You know, it's an issue of the next 2 decades. It's an issue that's so far down the road that it's very hard for people to say, well, I can push that off because I've got food security. I can push that off because there's something else going on. So I don't know the answer, but we've got to close in that gap. And I believe in youth because I talk to them and they want to have impact. They want to have impact, and they need to be telling everyone else how to do that.
A call to arms, positive end.
Yeah.
This conversation will continue, but this particular one wraps up right now. So thanks everyone for contributing. Many thanks to the panel.
Please join us for coffee and exhibits in the foyer. The program will resume promptly.